and good afternoon to everyone joining us today. I just allowed a couple more minutes for people to join. Happy Water Awareness Month from the Arizona Department of Water Resources. My name is Nemesis Ortiz, and I am the Drought and Conservation Coordinator at the Arizona Department of Water Resources, or ADWR. And I want to quickly remind participants to please mute yourselves during the presentation so we can hear the presenter. We will have time for questions at the end of the presentation. So during that time, I would encourage anyone interested in asking something to please either unmute yourself or type your question in the chat and I will read them for you. This webinar is being recorded and it will be shared through the ADWR YouTube page for those who missed it. I will provide a brief Water Awareness Month introduction and then we can continue with the webinar. The Arizona Department of Water Resources and our water conservation partners from around the state invite you, your family, and your neighbors to join in the celebration of Water Awareness Month, or WAM as we like to call it. The WAM website was first launched in 2011 and is overflowing with ideas and activities to help you learn more about water conservation and become more water aware of our state's most precious resource, water. The availability and quality of our water supply is critical to our quality of life. Therefore, this essential and precious resource was recognized by Arizona's governor in 2008 with an executive order that designates April as Water Awareness Month. Many thanks to Arizona's water awareness partners from around the state who contribute events, tips, and resources to the website and help promote water awareness. And I would like to introduce our speaker for today's webinar titled Colorado River Forecast Center and the Science of Forecasting Streamflow for Decision Making. Paul Miller is the Service Coordination Hydrologist at the Colorado River Forecast Center, or CRBFC, where he has been for 9 years. Prior to joining the CBRFC, he worked for the Bureau of Reclamation in the Boulder Canyon Operations Office for approximately 7 years. He received a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Hydrology and Water Resources from the University of Arizona, an MS in Environmental Engineering from the University of Notre Dame, and received his PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where he studied the impacts of climate change to the Colorado River Basin, in part through the use of CBRFC hydrologic models and projected temperature and precipitation data sets. Welcome, Paul, and thank you for joining us today. Over to you.
Great, thanks, Nemesis. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Great. Hey, thanks everybody for having me for Water Awareness Month in Arizona. I had no idea it was Water Awareness Month in Arizona until we were approached about this webinar. So I'm really happy to be able to give this presentation today and give you all an overview of who we are at the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center and how we do what we do in the context of the Colorado River Basin as a whole. So if we go to the next slide. I just have a really quick outline here for you all. It's just a quick overview of who we are at the CBRC. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the Colorado River Basin and why the water is split up the way it is. Just very generally speaking, not diving a ton into the policy, but just kind of giving an overview of some of the policy and how we end up fitting into that policy. And then how we develop a forecast, talk about some of the current impacts, and then talk a little bit about what the future might look like as we continue to navigate this very dry period and drought conditions that we're in. Next slide. So who we are at the CBRFC, we're one of 13 river forecast centers nationwide. We're co-located with a subset of the 122 weather forecast offices that you may work with more closely. In Arizona, there's a Flagstaff office, a Phoenix office, and a Tucson office that we work with very closely, especially during monsoon season when we're trying to provide support during those flash flood events, even though our model sometimes doesn't quite nail it with those very flashy events. But we're all about providing decision support. So whether it's working with our weather forecast offices or if it's working with our reservoir operators like the Bureau of Reclamation, um, we're all about trying to produce the best information that we can so that folks can make the best decisions that they can. And my job is all about how can we do that in the best way possible. So if you have ideas or you're a reservoir manager or resource manager, definitely let me know if you think there's a way that we can help you out, because that's my entire position at the office, is just focused in on how can we um, do decision support in the best possible way. Next slide. So like I said, we work with a bunch of weather forecast offices. Here's just a slide that kind of shows the ones that cover most of our area. And we're co-located with the Salt Lake City Weather Forecast Office in Salt Lake City. And we really rely on our WFO partners to be our eyes and ears on the ground. They work mostly with the emergency managers. They're the flash flood experts, especially when it's very localized. And like I mentioned earlier, water resource agencies like the Arizona Department of Water Resources and the Central Arizona Project and Salt River Project, those are some of our primary stakeholders. We work really closely with them um, to help them make decisions regarding how they're going to operate reservoirs. In the news, you'll hear a lot about like Powell and like Mead. Our forecasts directly impact how they operate those reservoirs. So yeah, if you have any questions about that, definitely feel free to reach out, and I'd be happy to talk more. So next slide, and we'll talk a bit more about the Colorado River Basin and the different laws that govern it. But it's such a great place to work because it's 30 million people and growing. There's about 4 million irrigated acres that are supported by Colorado River inside and outside of the basin itself. About 4,200 megawatts of hydropower generated. There's 15 Native American tribes located on Colorado River Basin land. We serve 7 basin states and 2 nations when you count Mexico. And there was a recent study, kind of recent study out of Arizona State University showing that there's almost a $2 billion impact on the regional economy. And I imagine that number has only gone up since that study's come out. Next slide. So in the basin, there's 16.5 million acre feet of water that's allocated annually, 7.5 to each of the upper and lower basin states, and 1.5 million acre feet to Mexico. Historically, only about 16 million acre feet is what we've seen on average coming into the basin. So you can already tell there's a little bit of an imbalance there. But the inflows are highly variable year to year, and we'll show that on the next slide. But we've been able to get through very dry periods like the current one that we're in because we have about 60 million acre feet worth of storage, most of it in Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And we were really fortunate that those reservoirs were pretty much full at the beginning of this drought, right around 1999, 2000. And when you consider that we've had about 21, 22 dry years, and only recently this past year has been the first one that there's been a shortage in the lower Colorado River Basin. It really speaks to how well these reservoirs have operated and been managed to mitigate the impacts from the drought. And a lot of this is all done through a bunch of water policy and laws that's kind of collectively known as the law of the river. So next slide, please. So like I mentioned, the hydrology in our area is very variable from one year to the next. Last year was a historically dry year. I think it ended up being the top 3 driest on the record, but that doesn't give us much of a sense on what this year is going to be. And this year is shaping up to be not dry, not nearly as dry as last year, but definitely below average. But there's nothing in this basin, or there's nothing in the record right now that tells us, hey, you're in for more dry years, or next year can't be a really wet year, or next month won't be a really wet year. It wasn't that long ago that we had that miracle May that brought record precip. to our area in May, um, and that really helped things out a little bit. So just a lot of hydroclimatic variability going on in our area. And this plot of natural flow over the upper Colorado River Basin just kind of shows that, we've had really high years mixed in with those really dry years, and everything in between. Next slide, please. And when you look at Lake Mead and when it was first built, you can see what the effects of that variability were. If you look right at the beginning of Lake Mead um, historical record, you can just see how jumpy and how responsive it was to the hydroclimatic variability in our area. And then you can see right about when Lake Powell was built towards the early 70s here, you can see just because of the way the policy works and how much water is consistently delivered more or less from Lake Powell, just how much less variability there was in Lake Mead's elevation and just how much more steady things were. And you can see highlighted here in September of 1999, Mead was basically full at 95% capacity. And just recently, back in March, it was only down to 33% capacity, and you can just see the effect of that the last 20 years or so have had on Lake Mead. Next slide. So here's Lake Powell's similar graphic, and Powell went into operation much later than Lake Mead, but you can see all that hydroclimatic variability is now at Lake Powell. So Lake Powell is much more responsive to the hydrology in the basin. It's more responsive to the year-to-year variation in the snowpack and just the rainfall that we get over the basin. And you can see here again, September 1999, things are pretty full. We're looking good. And then over the last 20 years, just that mostly consistent downward trend to where we're only at about a quarter of capacity right now, and inching closer to that minimum power pool elevation. Next slide. And again, I just wanted to stress that, over the last 20 years or so, the reservoirs have done what they were designed to do. They've really helped us make it through this really persistent dry period. I like to tell folks that the Colorado River Basin is we're really well equipped to handle very severe drought periods. You can look at 2002 when we only had 24% of average inflow into the basin. And for a lot of places in the world, that would just be a big check to their system. It would be really a huge blow. But for us, our reservoirs took a hit, but we've really managed to get through to today without any declared shortages in the lower Colorado River Basin just until last year. You can see since 2000, we've only had 5 years that have been above average. There's been a couple that have been slightly below average, but for the most part, it's been consistently below average years since 2000. Next slide. So kind of figuring where we start to fit into all of this. So water law in the West is really different from anywhere else in the country, which also makes our job different from a lot of the other river forecast centers anywhere else in the country. A lot of the water rights are first in time, first in right. Basically, if you could get to the water first and develop it, that water was yours. And subsequent users can come so long as they don't impact senior water rights. That's especially true in Arizona. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then something interesting for our area is groundwater is typically treated totally separate, which I've always thought is interesting, but that's just kind of the way the policy's been written in the basin. But this Cadillac Desert book that's pictured here is a really great book if you have a chance to read it. It's all about water law in the West and how a lot of the storage projects came to be, and I recommend it even if it is slightly critical of the government. Next slide. So the original compact, this Colorado River Compact of 1922, it divided the basin into an upper and a lower half. and it allocated 7.5 million acre feet to each. And it stated that the upper basin has to deliver 75 million acre feet over a 10-year period, a rolling 10-year period, to the lower basin every 10 years. So when you see like folks saying that, oh, the upper basin has to deliver 7.5 million acre feet to the lower basin, this is where that number comes from. It's just taking that 75 number and dividing it over 10 years. Next slide. And that compact's evolved quite a bit. So there was the Boulder Canyon Project Act of 1928, and this is where the lower basin states got together and divided up that 7.5 million acre feet among the states. And the lower basin states are really lucky in that Mead is sort of at the top of the system, and Lake Mead's available to deliver water when it's needed and where it's needed. We don't really have to rely on when is the snowpack melting, when is the snowpack going to be there, like the upper basin tends to do. Lake Mead kind of sits at the top there, so a lot of this water can be delivered through channels and canals just through gravity for the most part, but there is some pumping. But the big important thing to come up here is that the Secretary of the Interior was determined to be the lower basin water master. So that's why you'll see a lot of interaction with the Bureau of Reclamation in this area, just allocating water. And that's why they're one of our biggest stakeholders, if not our biggest stakeholder for our water supply forecast. Next slide. So Hoover Dam was constructed, and California paid for the construction of that dam. I recently found out that they paid off that mortgage way back in 1987, which I thought was pretty interesting and pretty cool. I'm still waiting to pay off my house, so it's pretty neat for someone to pay off a dam, I think. So, but support Los Angeles and the huge agricultural industry right there. But there was also hydropower considerations. I think Hoover Dam is really interesting because it's a peaking power plant. When I worked for Reclamation, one of the operators told me that they're changing the releases due to power demands, potentially on the order of every like 4 seconds, which I just thought was really cool. So and then just to the bigger point that much of the infrastructure over the Colorado River Basin has been paid for by the states. Next slide. And then when we get to our colleagues and neighbors to the south in Mexico, the Mexican Water Treaty of 1944, that's where Mexico and the US committed to make sure that we deliver 1.5 million acre feet to Mexico. And there's tons of subsequent minutes to this treaty, mostly describing water quality and shortage requirements. One thing that I think was really cool is, oh gosh, probably like a decade ago now, there was a big earthquake in Mexico, really hurt their infrastructure. I think it still continues to have impacts to this day. But it was a great opportunity for the US and Mexico to work together. They came up with a way to store, and I'm probably butchering this, but earthquake water, and I'm using my air quotes here, not that you can see me, but store earthquake water in Lake Mead so that Mexico, while they were repairing their infrastructure, could store some of their water in Mead, and for when they could reuse it again. And I just thought that's such a cool collaborative thing to do between the two countries. Next slide. So then kind of looking more towards the upper Colorado River Basin, the Compact of 1948 and the River Storage Project Act of 1956, this is what brought about the construction of all the dams in the upper basin, all the big ones, like the Aspinall Unit and Navajo and Flaming Gorge, and then Glen Canyon, of course, which holds back Lake Powell. But unlike the lower basin, they apportioned their water more by percentage of available water. So, they don't have the infrastructure that we have in the lower basin. In the upper basin, they're more reliant on the timing of the snow melt, how much snow is actually up there. They don't have the huge reservoirs of Mead and Powell just kind of standing at the top of their system to deliver water where it's necessary. They're a bit more at the whims of Mother Nature, I guess, on how and when they get their water. Next slide. And something that's particularly important to the folks on this phone call is the big Arizona versus California Supreme Court decision that basically allowed Arizona to build the Central Arizona project, but it gave California the senior rights on the system. And this becomes important today because when we talk about shortages and water allocations, California is that senior water right holder in the lower Colorado River Basin. So Arizona, Nevada, and even Mexico tend to take more of the shortage hit than California does, at least initially, mostly because of these senior rights that California holds. So getting next slide, so we can get to some more contemporary policy here. Back in 2007, this record of decision for operating Lake Powell and Lake Mead was signed by the Commissioner of Reclamation and the Secretary of Interior. And this thing did a lot of things. In addition to defining when shortages occur and what would happen in those shortages, it also said that explicitly the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center, so my office, is what Reclamation is going to use to drive their operational models. So, obviously we don't, but even if we sat at our desk with a magic 8-ball and came up with our streamflow forecast, Reclamation would have to use our forecast. But we don't do that, and I'll talk a bit more about how we do that. But we take this responsibility really seriously. We're always constantly striving to improve the quality of our forecast, the accuracy of our forecast. We work with Reclamation all the time. I was just emailing and talking with them this morning about some different projects that we can do to improve their forecast and their reservoir operations models. So it's definitely a very active and ongoing and continually being improved process. Though our forecasts are pretty good for the most part. Next slide. So just kind of going into a little bit more of what we provide for Reclamation, and you can see above this little graphic is the text from that record of decision that explicitly states that they have to use our forecast. But you might have heard that Reclamation uses a reservoir operations model called the 24-month study. And that 24-month study, if you look on those different pages and you see the unregulated inflow numbers, those numbers are mostly coming from our office, at least in the short term. And we give these, we develop these forecasts every day, but we make official forecasts at the beginning of each month. And then for some locations, we make a mid-month official forecast as well. And in August and April, these forecasts are particularly important because this is when Reclamation will make a lot of their decisions based on shortages and releases from Lake Powell and releases from Lake Mead. So those months in particular, we definitely pay a lot of attention to the data that's coming in and the forecast that we're making. Next slide. So here's our website, and this is, I would say, probably the primary way we interact with most of our stakeholders, just because there's so many of them, and we definitely take calls from anybody that is interested in our forecast. But most of our stakeholders are monitoring our website on a daily basis. When you go to our website, which is just cbrfc.noaa.gov, you're going to come to this map, and we make a forecast at about 500 points at least once a day. Most of these forecasts are 10-day deterministic forecasts. That just means there's not a lot of probability information involved. We're just kind of giving you what we think is going to happen over those next 10 days. And and again, we're constantly developing these to try and make them as accurate as possible. Next slide. So when we go into the office every day, this is kind of what we look at. This is a screenshot looking at the Green River up in southern Wyoming. And what I like to show here is that we're taking in precipitation and temperature information, both historical data that we're deriving from gauges in the area, and then forecasted information that we're obtaining from our weather forecast offices. And we're seeing how our model has done over the last 10 days or so. So for in this particular example, you can see the observed data from the USGS on the left, and our raw model is the blue line. And you can see that our model is following the observations from the USGS very well. So this gives us a pretty good amount of confidence that we think the next 10 days, our model is going to do well as well. So you can see here in this particular example, it's just showing some snow melt happening and some warming at some higher elevations. And you can kind of see the rise that we ended up forecasting. So this is what we look at 500 locations, give or take, every day, at least once a day, even more frequently when the snow is really melting or if there's a flooding event going on. This is what we're interacting with on a day-to-day basis. Next slide. And so when we're bringing in everything, so what you just saw is the output from this model that we use. And we use a lumped model. It's called the Sacramento Soil Moisture Accounting Model, and it's coupled with another snow model called Snow 17, though I'm not quite sure where the 17 comes from. But we bring in a ton of data every day. We bring in observed data from the USGS and the NRCS and reservoir operators like Reclamation and a bunch of other folks too. And then we get a lot of forecasted information based on the weather or reservoir operations. There's lots of model parameters that we take a look at to make sure they're behaving in a proper way. And then we as forecasters, we interact with the model. We are constantly trying to look for evidence of where our model data can be improved, or evidence that shows that our model data is as correct as it can be. So we interact with that every day. And I like this little Lego picture just showing that we do this even during telework. We can remote in and work with that forecast just to try and get everything to be as representative of current conditions as we possibly can. So next slide. So once we've got everything to where it's representing the current hydrologic conditions of the basin as best as we possibly can, we've kind of verified or validated the model parameters that are in there, like the snowpack, like the soil moisture, like the reservoir storage. Once we feel that we're in a really good spot there, what we do is we come up with an ensemble. And this is what we use to develop our water supply forecast. And what do we mean by an ensemble? Well, what we do is we take the best information. So like today's April 13th. So we've got all the best information. Our model is acting as best as we think we can possibly get it, all the way up through April 12th. So from April 12th all the way to the end of the water year, and more importantly, I guess, all the way through the end of July when most of the snow melt will be gone, we're going to take all the historic temperature and precipitation traces from April 13th all the way till the end of the water year, all for each year from 1991 through 2020. So that's 30 years. So we're coming up with 30 possible hydrologic futures. And some of them are wet, like I think like 2011 was a wet year, 2012 might have been a wet year. And then some of those years have been very dry. 2002 comes to mind as the driest on record, and everywhere in between. So we come up with what this ensemble, or this range of possible futures, is what we base our water supply forecast on. Next slide, please. And so when we're looking at this, we come up with this big spaghetti plot worth of years and data. And you can see here, we've got this forecast period of interest. Our April through July forecasts are our most popular product, mostly because That's when all the snow melt occurs. That's when the vast majority of the runoff makes its way down to Lake Powell. Um, and so we're looking at this big spaghetti plot worth of possible futures and saying, okay, when you see this big distribution of Streamflow, what's that median value? What are we going to think is that 50 percentile value that we can use to convey that message to our stakeholders, um, and for our stakeholders that have other levels of risk, what other percentiles can we look at and take out of this so that they can make decisions that they're really comfortable with? So next slide. So we take that big confusing spaghetti plot that you just saw and we distill it down into a much um, easier to manage plot. And so this ensemble here, this is from last year, but I just wanted to show what it looks like as we make our way through the year. But if you go to our website and you look at our water supply forecast, we're making water supply forecasts at about 175 locations throughout the basin. And what you'll see here, and I'll explain in more detail as we get a bit further on, is on the next slide, is that we take that big spaghetti ensemble and we just color in that range. So that's that shaded blue area that you're seeing here. And then every month when we make our official forecast, these pink lines, we break those down by percentiles, and we do this every day. We come up with a new forecast so that folks can kind of see, oh, I just had a big rain event in my area. How is that affecting the forecast? Or, man, it's been a really dry week. How is that affecting our forecast? And you can see as we make our way through April through July, we start adding in the observation and the observed data to see how well we're tracking with what normal conditions are like in the basin. And so hopefully the next slide will be a bit more clear because I've labeled it a lot better. So next slide. So here's the current forecast. This is current as of yesterday. And this is what things are looking like at Lake Powell. And what I'd like to point out here is you can see at the beginning of the year in January, a lot of the snowpack in the upper basin was above average, and with and taking into account like the dry soils and other things, we thought there was a good chance of having average runoff back in January. And you can kind of see from our official forecast in January that our 50% value is right there at that average value in the solid green line. And we thought, hey, there's a 10% chance that we could get, like 11 million acre feet. And then we were also saying that, there's like a 90, a 10% chance that we would get something less than 4 million acre feet. And you can kind of see things stayed that way through about middle of January. And then, basically end of January and then the entire month of February was just historically dry. February was one of the driest months on record. And you can just see how much of an impact that's had on our forecast for Lake Powell's April through July inflow. Things seem to have leveled off about the end of February, early March. We've had some storms come by, but it's just been very dry since about the end of January for the most part. And now our forecast is, where it was about near average conditions in January. Now we're only forecasting about 65% of average, and a forecast of just a bit over 4 million acre feet heading into the runoff season here. So we'll see how things play out. Like I said before, we live in a very variable region as far as the hydrology goes. We could still have a very wet May or a very wet June, and who knows? We've had a couple storms here up in Utah lately that have helped things out a little bit. Similar things can happen in the Colorado River Basin. So If you go to our website and look for the Lake Powell forecast graph, you'll see this plot evolve as one, we get more observed streamflow information, and then two, as storms happen or not happen over the runoff period. Next slide, please. So just kind of talking about the impacts of our forecast and also the actual water that is seen. Like I mentioned earlier, the first shortage in the lower Colorado River Basin was declared by Reclamation, and this has been in the news a lot lately. And it's brought an increased focus on our forecast because folks want to know what is driving the model that Reclamation uses. And by and large, it's our forecast. There's environmental impacts and recreational impacts. We have a recreation page on our website that a lot of boaters and kayakers like to take a look at. And we also translate it into like a phone message, and you'd be shocked at the number of phone calls this particular line gets with people just wanting to know when the ideal time is to raft down a particular section of river. And like I mentioned at the start of this, there's big economic impacts, both to the hydropower industry, recreational industry, municipal water users and agricultural water users. Everyone's impacted by the water availability in the Colorado River Basin. And these decisions are being made every day based on our forecast. So it's not something we take lightly. We're constantly looking to improve this. Next slide. I stole a couple of these slides from Reclamation just to kind of further illustrate the impacts that are going on. But you can kind of see that Lake Powell is operating in what they call a mid-elevation release tier. So they're only releasing just under 7.5 million acre feet down to Lake Mead, which is a bit less than the 8.23 that they would under more normal conditions, if I can use normal term. And Mead's operating in that shortage condition. Next slide. And you can see, and also that what's been in the news a lot lately is Reclamation in cooperation with a lot of the states has been coming up with all kinds of drought contingency plans and ways to help mitigate the impacts to Lake Powell and Lake Mead and try to stave off the impacts of these shortages as much as possible. And you can see all the states and Mexico have been cooperating and collaborating with this, so that everyone can kind of share in these shortage impacts as things continue to be dry. Next slide. So what does the future look like? And at the River Forecast Center, we try to stay out of the policy realm a bit. We don't want our forecast to be influenced by hitting any sort of trigger levels or policy implications. So we really just try to base everything off of, the physical evidence of precip and temperature and what is our model showing us. But that being said, we're very actively involved with our stakeholders to come up with the best science and methods that we can use going forward when it comes to developing these forecasts and how these forecasts can be used most effectively going into the future. The interim guidelines that Reclamation is currently operating under are only good through 2026. So it's coming up here pretty soon where how Reclamation uses our forecasts and how other stakeholders use our forecast, that's all up for debate right now. That's all up for what's the best way to use our forecast going forward. So we're working really closely with a group that we call the Colorado River Basin Climate and Hydrology Work Group. It's informally led by the Southern Nevada Water Authority, but tons of Arizona representation, tons of Upper Colorado representation. And we're a very active participant. We recently completed a sensitivity analysis, and we've been publishing these water year in review documents in response to this work group. We've got projects funded from our climate program office with the University of Colorado and the University of Arizona. Um, just looking at different data sets and different ways that we can use data going forward to make more accurate forecasts. So this is a really great work group that we're really happy to be a part of going forward, and hope that it serves as a foundational basis for whatever the next iteration of these guidelines look like. Next slide. So like I said, when it comes to policy development, that's not really us. That's not really our role. That's more reclamation in the states. Um, but we try to be as open and transparent and available as possible. Tons of stakeholder interaction, tons of direct outreach. My emails at the end of this presentation, definitely feel free to email me if you have any questions or comments or thoughts. I'd love to hear from all of you. Any ideas that you might have, I will definitely read them and respond to all of them to the best of my ability. So next slide. But what's been really great, kind of, I think I've almost worked in the basin now for a little over 15 years now, and just to see the amount of collaboration and cooperation between all the states and agencies. I've just gotten to work with a bunch of different and cool people, and the inclusivity that is going on just feels like it's growing within the Colorado River Basin. So hopefully us at the River Forecast Center and the Weather Service, we can continue to be part of that collaborative effort. We definitely try our best to do so. So with that, if we go to our next slide, I think that's my last slide. Yeah, if you have any questions, we can speak a lot to the water supply and the streamflow forecast. If you have questions about policy or operations, we'll answer as much as we can, but we'll get you in touch with our reclamation colleagues that really know the ins and outs and have their fingers on the pulse of that kind of stuff. And Michelle Stokes is my boss. Her contact information is there too. And yeah, with that, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you very much, Paul, for your presentation. We do have time for questions. We have about 15 minutes left if anyone is interested. I think the presentation was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that background behind the 24-month study. We've always heard about 24-month study and the projections, but I hadn't heard before about how the data they use comes from the forecast center. So that was really impressive. Thank you. I do have a question. We know that hydrology is influenced by many different things in the basin, but from a hydroclimate perspective, what needs to happen to bring reservoir elevations to an average level?
Oh, well, that's a great question, and and it's a hard question to answer too, because I think in other parts of the world, when you're dealing with much smaller reservoirs that kind of fill and spill on an annual basis, it's a lot easier to think of, oh, where is this reservoir normally at? But when you think about our area and just how massive these reservoirs are and their ability to store like 4 times the average annual inflow, um, what it's harder to quantify what that average storage condition would be. But I would say that most of our stakeholders, when we get to a point where we're in a surplus condition, where Mead is at an elevation where states can take extra water if they need to, I think that's really where the states would love to be. And it's going to take, I think I did some back of the envelope calculations last year, and that was before our very dry year last year. And I think, if I remember right, I think we needed like 3 consecutive years at like 130% of average to get and don't quote me on that number because I'd have to redo the numbers now. But it was something on that kind of scale where we really needed like 3 or 4 well above average years to hit where we have like where we're not, just thinking about being in a shortage condition or a release tier from Lake Powell that's less than optimal, I guess.
Thank you. We've heard something similar from the state climatologist here in Arizona, mentioning how in order to kind of mitigate long-term drought in the state, 3 consecutive years of wet years of a lot of precipitation would be the answer to that. So
Yeah.
it is a similar answer.
glad
Thank
glad
you.
I'm in good company then.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat from Tom. It says, do you look at the effects of anthropogenic activities on flow? For instance, groundwater pumping in the upper Colorado River Basin?
Well, when it comes to groundwater pumping, I'd say we look at that indirectly. Our model accounts for water that we bring in a lot of information from diverters and irrigators, and even then, when we go through our model, we know that there is water that is coming from sources that we don't have explicitly defined in our model. So groundwater pumping could be one of those sources, and um, we model that as what we would call a channel gain in our model. So, but I would say in our model, it's not explicitly defined as groundwater pumping. When it comes to more anthropogenic kind of impacts and just climate change in general, right now we've got a research project looking at, I was saying earlier, we use temperature traces that go back to 1991, and we know that the temperatures in the 90s were cooler than the temperatures today. So we are working with some researchers to adjust those past temperatures so that they are more representative of today's current temperature trends. And we think that there's a good possibility that we can improve our forecast a little bit by bringing up all the historical temperatures to be more reflective of today's conditions. So that's just one way that we're kind of looking to account for more of these anthropogenic effects.
Thank you. Does anyone have any additional questions? Feel free to unmute yourself or add them to the chat. Don't see any questions, but thank you so much, Paul. And thank you to all who joined us today. If anyone is interested in checking out last year's Water Awareness Month webinars, you can find them on the ADWR YouTube website, and I added it to the chat. We have lots of useful and interesting webinars planned over the week and next week as well. I will also add that to the chat in the website. And with that, I will end. Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.
Great. Thanks, everybody.